22 long rifle. Are you crazy for using 22 long rifle for self-defense? Especially having a pistol? Well, respectfully, I'm going to say maybe. So I did a test recently where I tested just some average 22 long rifle versus some 9mm, just to kind of show how 22 long rifle will stack up compared to 9mm. And I got a lot of comments in that video of people saying, well, you used the worst possible 22 long rifle ammo you could have used. You know, the results would have been significantly different if you used what people said, most people said, Federal Punch. And I will admit, Federal Punch is a pretty good ammunition. Now, looking at all of this, when we're talking self-defense, it's been said for years and years and years and years that you should start with, as your lowest possible caliber, a 380 ACP. You know, you go 380 ACP and up. So with your most common cartridges, your lowest one you want to use for self-defense is 380, then up to 38 special, then 9mm, then 40, 45, 357, and so on. So this has been the advice for a lot of years. That's where you start. So I want to compare where you're supposed to start, from a lot of experts from years ago would say, to where a lot of people nowadays say you should start with 22 long rifle because of the advancement in bullet technology and all of that. So we're going to compare our 22 caliber 22 LR Federal Punch to our 380 Federal Punch. This is a 29 grain flat nose, and I do know from experience making a flat nose bullet does make it penetrate better, and this round does make a lot of sense in a lot of ways because it's a 29 grain. 22 long rifle, you know, when 22 short came out and 22 long back in the 19th century, it was a 29 grain pistol bullet, and then it was turned into a rifle bullet by adding a little bit more charge, but then making that bullet a 40 grain bullet. With this makes a lot of sense because we're adding all the power, all the charge of a 22 long rifle round, but we're using a pistol bullet and a flat nose. So that makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. And then with our 380, that is an 85 grain jacketed hollow point. So honestly, I think these are pretty good choices to test 380 versus 22 long rifle. So another thing that I get to thinking about with this stuff is a lot of people are just looking at like ballistic gel tests and looking at plain gel shots into ballistic gel and being like, well, you get good penetration. But with self-defense, there's a lot of other things that can come into play, like hard barriers and other types of barriers. So what I want to do is I'm going to do a ballistic gel test like I normally do, but then I'm also going to do a little bit of a different test here. I'm going to put up basically an arm bone simulation here. And the reason for that is a lot of times when people are in shootouts, they don't realize this, but somebody else is going to be shooting back at them and they're going to be like this, and you may have to encounter an arm bone, go through that before actually hitting the thoracic cavity. So having an arm bone simulation on there is a good idea to put into a test to see how 22 long rifle and 380 do against that. Another thing here, I have 22 gauge piece of steel here, and this can kind of represent a lot of different things, but maybe the outer body of a car door. It's a little bit thin for that actually, but I think it's good to put some steel up and just kind of see how these rounds will do, you know, hitting a hard barrier. So let me show you the rest of what I'm going to do with this test, and we'll get started with this test. All right, so here is our ammunition, our Federal Punch in 380 ACP and 22 long rifle. Our 380 ACP is an 85 grain jacketed hollow point rated at 1,000 feet per second. Our 22 long rifle is a 29 grain solid flat nose that is rated at 1,070 feet per second. It does show that 1,070 feet per second is through a 2-inch barrel, and I believe that the 380 is rated through a 4-inch barrel. So I'm going to use it's about 3.7 inch Smith & Wesson Shield EZ in 380 versus my 4-inch Taurus TX22 to do this test. So we're going to go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy we get at the same time. Then I'm going to do my 10% clear ballistic gel test. So our first test is going to be 2 layers of t-shirt followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics to represent hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard to represent hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, and another 1/4 inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. That's our real world simulation, and you got to remember that's about half representation of the density of flesh. So if we got like 16 inches in here, it'd be like 8 inches on a real living target. Then after that test, what I want to do is kind of our arm bone simulation. So I'll set this up in front of the jaw block. I know it's not a perfect setup because, you know, perfect would be more of at an angle, but it's really impossible to do that and still get it to go straight through into the gel. So we're just going to have our arm bone simulation set up, and we'll see how that does with an arm bone. And then we'll do another test where we're going to put up our 22 gauge steel here, and we'll do a hard barrier test with these and see how they both compare doing that type of a test. Then I will shoot at the steel target to see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. And that is one hallmark of a 22, is very easy to shoot fast. So we'll see if there's really a big difference in practical shootability. So let's get started with this test. All right, first up we have our 380 ACP. It's rated at 1,000 feet per second. Let's see how close we get to that 1,000 feet per second rated. 940, 978, 922, 931, 958. So we're pretty far away from that rated velocity there. I was hoping for a little bit better. Our 22 long rifle, this is rated at 1070, but that's through a 2-inch barrel, so we're using about a 4-inch barrel. See how close we get to 1070. 1189, 1208, 1202, 1193, 1186. So quite a bit above that rated velocity. So our 380s will looking worse than what it should have because it's below rated velocity, and our 22 is looking better than what you would think it would be because we're above that rated velocity. Let's hit our ballistics gel block and see how these compare. All right, so we're going to do our real world simulation. This is kind of our summertime attire where I just got 2 layers of t-shirt on the front of that gel block, followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics to represent hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard to represent hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, then another 1/4 inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. Ideally, I want these both to stay within that back rib simulation, but still penetrate to at least 12 inches. So let's see if we get here with our 380 ACP. All right. Wow, that kind of underpenetrated there. You know, let me do one more shot because that's not right. That's not been like that in the past. One more. Well, we confirmed it. Now let's hit it with our 22 long rifle. Let's go take a look. All right, so I popped off a couple of 22 long rifles to be fair there, and the sun really is coming out and glowing on these blocks. Hard to see in there, right? Interesting, a lot more energy dump in our first 3 inches with our 380 because that's expanding out quite a bit. But you know, we severely underpenetrated, which is not typical of this ammo. I've tested this before and it has not done this before quite like that. So what we got with our 380 is 7 1/4 inches. Parallax will make it seem like it's a step deeper, but yeah, 7 1/4. And that next shot did give us a little bit more, but we're only at 8 inches. As we're with our punch 22, we got 12.5 and about 12 inches. So honestly, looking at this, it's hard to say. Now with a front on shot, I'm going to say that our 380s definitely has more damage in there and it would go deep enough. But if possibly if we're going through an arm, maybe that wouldn't be enough, and the 22 would be. And that's kind of where, you know, sometimes these type of tests we have to do kind of something a little bit different, like the arm bone test, to see how true all that stuff is. So let's put up our arm bone thing, simulation thing in there, and we'll see how they do that way. All right, our arm bone simulation. This is kind of difficult to do because that thing's wanting to sway around a little bit. So I got to go through the center of that and still land a bullet in the ballistic shell. So let's see what we get here with our 380 ACP. All right. And it did go through center. Now let's move this a little bit. Try to do that same thing with our 22 and see if we can get that to go into the ballistics gel. The wind is wanting to sway that thing. 22 long rifle. Let's see how this does. Let's go take a look. Well, now I'm going to eat my words because the 22 outperformed the 380 in this test. And if we pull out this arm bone simulation, we can see that we went through center with both of these. There's our 380, here is our 22. So normally this would not play out like this, but with the advancement of pretty good ammo, 22 is no slouch. That's pretty impressive for a 22. Pull out our rib simulation. You know, here's our first 380s, and then there's our 22s. Big difference there. And then again, our 380, it's hard to see, but it's a pretty big hole going through our arm bone versus the 22 is kind of small. So with our 380 ACP, with this particular test, we've got about 7 3/4 and still expanding all that, so that's pretty good. But with our 22, you know, we got about 8 1/8 or something like that. So there's a very small difference there. It's kind of hard to tell if one would be better than the other here, because there's a little bit more penetration with the 22, but obviously the 380 made a bigger hole. So I'm not really sure how to call that. Let's put on our hard barrier, our piece of steel, and see how these do in that type of test. All right, so I just swapped the blocks around there, and then I put our 22 gauge steel up there, and every other aspect of that setup is the same with our fabric and our rib simulation there. I know it's not ideal to have the steel just setting there, but I don't realistically have a way to back it off and hold it. You know, I don't have anybody to hold it up while I shoot at it, so it's best to just to put it right there where I can hit it. So 380 ACP steel test. That's a pretty big hole there. All right, 22 long rifle. Let's see how this does. Let's go take a look. I'm pretty impressed there still. Like, wow. Our 380 obviously did a lot better, and it did better with this type of test versus what it did without the steel there, which is pretty impressive in and of itself. Difference in hole size there. Obviously our 380 is bigger. Rib simulation. Obviously our 380 is a little bigger, but it looks like the punch pretty much held together. It didn't just fragment or anything like that. It looks like it mushroomed a little bit. Now, technically it under penetrated, but it still looks pretty good. Now with our With our 380 here, we got about 13 3/4 inches, so that would do okay after going through a little barrier like that. Our 22, we only got about 9 3/4. It's a little bit shallow, but I'm really impressed at all that it went through like that, the way that it did. So we can say that modern 22 ammo made for a pistol makes a big difference here overall, because I believe that type of test with the 22 with the just a soft lead stuff, I think we went to like 3 or 4 inches or something like that, maybe not even that. But this actually makes it go at least twice as far after going through that. So that is an impressive result there. So looking at this, what I can say is, you know, for the most part, if we cherry pick the ammo, I still think that we're going to have significantly better performance with 380. I've seen a lot of 380 rounds hit over 12 inches of penetration while expanding pretty well. It's just that this particular punch extremely overexpanded and didn't go very deep, so that was kind of poor performance on that part. And then when we look at 22, most 22 rounds don't perform this well, and this is probably the best performing 22. So it looks like with the best performing 22, I'm going to say it's comparable, maybe even better than kind of a poor performing 380. But yeah, I mean, I'm just very impressed with that. So I'll leave it at that. I'll let people have their day with this. It's a pretty good performance for a 22. So let's pull these all out of the block. We'll take a close-up look at these bullets. Then I'll shoot our steel and see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. All right, so here's a close-up look at these bullets going through our original test with just our 2 layers of fabric and our rib simulation and all of that. No barriers on the way. There's our 380s. It's our first shot and our second shot, or here's our first shot here and our second shot here. About the same thing going on. So those things have a lot of expansion. They just don't have a lot of mass after that, after expanding so big. You know, the sectional density is so low, or they just pancake out and they don't penetrate enough. I'd like to see better penetration with that. And if we look at our 22s, here's our first shot here and our second one over here. And those deformed a little bit. You know, here's the thing, you know, this is, I guess, personal preference. Do you want a lot of under penetration that's probably enough on a front shot with that, or do you want this that's gonna, you know, reliably go deeper, but it's a smaller size bullet? So I think there's some trade-offs there. Both did pretty good in their own right, but you know, we just didn't get enough penetration with that 380. Now with our shot through our arm bone simulation here, what we got is about, you know, similar. A little bit smaller expansion with our 380, but I'm really kind of impressed that it went through that, being a 380, still expanded, and still went, I think, a little bit deeper than what it did in the original shot because the bullet's smaller there. So it's actually pretty impressive in and of itself. And then with this is also impressive because, you know, it's a hard enough alloy that it didn't just flatten into nothing, and it just kept penetrating. So they must be using a little harder alloy than typical, which is the right move to make a good round like this. Now, making it jacketed is not a good idea because you get too much drag, but if you make kind of a hard cast, well, that makes more sense. It's still going to go down the bore really slick, get good velocity, and still like hold together a little bit better. So that's probably what they're doing, and that's pretty good overall. Now going through our steel barrier, this is really impressive in both rights, because with our 380, this did everything that the HST does. It's like it's designed almost the same as the HST. So for a budget round of ammo, especially in like 9mm or something like that, where we're going to get a more appropriate penetration, you know, this is a good round of ammo for a budget round. You know, it's comparable in price to like critical defense or maybe even less, but yet it's doing better. This is more like a law enforcement grade round, the way it folds in and keeps penetrating after going through a hard barrier. That's really good. And also with our 22, this is really good. Obviously it mushroomed, but again, this is illustrating that has to be a pretty hard lead alloy, or else that would have flattened to nothing and severely underpenetrated a lot more than what it did. So looking at all of this, you know, it's all impressive in some way, one or another. The 380 is impressive just because it does expand, but it is still doing 380 things where it doesn't want to penetrate enough. If it does that, It's a good bullet. They just need to make it maybe a little bit heavier. I think it would do a little bit better. But looking at this, as far as the 22 goes, compared to other 22s, I mean, this is an incredibly well-performing 22 compared to typical. That is a very good performing round. So I'm highly impressed with it. So that's a close-up look at those bullets. All right, so a lot of people say it's all about shot placement. Well, it's important to get shot placement. It's not all about it. That's a funny thing people say, because why are you not making shot placement? And a lot of people argue, well, if there's too much recoil, but honestly, that's kind of a moot point, because if you just slow it down a little bit, if you've shot at least once in your life, you can kind of work around that. But let's just see if there's a big difference here between 380 and 22. So I'm gonna do some center mass shots as fast as I think I can hit the target, and then I'll go for some head shots, just a couple of them, as fast as I think I can hit the target, and see if there's a big difference here. So 380, let's see how this does. So this ammo's shooting a little bit high out of that pistol there, and I have to like take a moment there to line up those sights. It's pretty doable though. 22 long rifle, let's see how this does. Alright, so I'm just popping them off pretty quickly. I did have more misses because this kind of created a little bit false sense of security with my abilities, because of how low that recoil is. So I think that is something to think about, because it is easy for this to get away from you. Granted, you can land more shots on target with something like this, and people always tell me with a rimfire you want to use a revolver only. When I'm thinking about 22 long rifle, I think the opposite. Now, most of the time I'm going to say use of a revolver for an average person is the better choice, because generally within 5 shots you can stop a threat. But when you're talking a 22, maybe they won't be that effective. So it's the best option, in my opinion, to use a semi-auto with as high capacity as you can get, and then try to vet some ammo to make sure it runs reliably. I think that's a little bit better choice. So let me back it up just a little bit with these and see how these shoot from a little more distance, and see how much they might move the target around. All right, 40 yards from the target just for fun. I only have a couple rounds of the 380 left, so I'm going to try to make these things count. So 380, let's see if I can land these 2 shots. I think that hit a little high. Yeah, so those are still shooting really high from my point of aim, so interesting. Now 22, I got a bunch of these rounds left. Let's see how these do. Alright, so those are hitting quite a bit to the right for some reason. So let me try to make some headshots. I got about the right elevation. I just got to aim a little bit to the left. So see if I can make a headshot with 22, 40 yards. Let me try a few more times. All right, I'm going to keep trying to land some headshots here. That's not easy, but what I can say is we went through a box of that 22 ammo, and that stuff was very, very reliable out of this pistol. So, you know, that's 2 things here that we accomplished testing the Federal Punch. Looking for an ammo that might be a little bit more reliable than typical rimfire. Got that with this. And looking for an ammo that has better terminal ballistics, and it's had significantly better than typical. So I guess it's time I'm gonna have to eat my words and say, you know, maybe I was wrong on it. Now, looking at overview, I don't think I'm wrong necessarily when we're talking like the overview here. You know, for years and years and years, 22 ammo has been what it has been. And it's only been within the past, I want to say 5 years or so, the ammo companies have took the time to actually develop rounds that are made specifically for self-defense out of a pistol. And I think Federal at least is doing a pretty good job at it. You know, CCI has the uppercut, and then you have like, I want to say the silver tip, Winchester silver tip. I think there's a couple more other choices out there, but honestly, when I look at all the different choices there are, all of them seem to underperform except for the Federal punch, because anytime you get a hollow point, let's say you got the uppercut, and if it expands, it's going to underpenetrate, and a lot of times it doesn't expand, and on top of that, it is a jacketed bullet, and it increases more drag, more than what you want, even though it does have a band around the bullet to reduce it a little bit. There's still a little bit more drag there, and it brings your power down kind of low. We have other choices like Interceptor, Agilent Interceptor, CCI Velociter, and some of those do okay, but you're making the rounds so powerful, sometimes they are not reliable on a lot of semi-automatic handguns. And then you have rounds like the old school Stinger, and those are pretty good, but again, if you get expansion, they severely underpenetrate. So looking at all the premium rounds, the punch is the one where you stay kind of at a normal power level. It's going to remain reliable. We got nickel-plated cases for reliability, and we're punching pretty deep every time. So out of all the rounds of 22 long rifle, you know, that I would recommend, I would never recommend the 22 long rifle for self-defense, but if you are going to go that route, I highly recommend the Federal punch, because I've tested it a few times. It does really well. Now 380, I think overall 380 is still a better caliber, and doing this test kind of makes it look a lot worse than what it is, kind of in a similar way that the last time I tested 22, it looked pretty bad because I used just regular lead round nose. If we had a better 380, 380 outperforms 22 by a mile, but with this ammo, our 22 did a little bit better. So interesting. That's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like, and thanks for watching.